Today I'm going to basically talk about my book. As you know, this is a book on the politics of historic preservation. And I began this project 10 years ago when I was still a graduate student. And I got interested in the subject of historic preservation because I saw too much change in my hometown, Beijing. And I was very sad to see many places from my memory were demolished. So I wanted to write a book on historic preservation in order to understand the changes that not only my city, but many other cities in the world have gone through. And at the beginning of my research, I thought I knew clearly what preservation is. To preserve is to save the physical form of the building, right? But after I began my fieldwork, I was very confused about what preservation is. Let me show you some photos. This is a city gate on the south side of Beijing. It's named Yongdingmen. It looks very historical. It was actually built in 2005. And this is a photo of the original Yongdingmen. It was first built in the 16th century and demolished in 1950s. So the restoration project took place after Beijing was chosen as the host city of the 2008 Olympic Games, and is part of the city's cultural heritage preservation plan for the Olympics. And not far away from the rebuilt city gate, an old neighborhood named Qianmen was demolished in the same year. And the plan is to replace those centuries-old square houses with historical-looking new buildings. And no one who lived there before will be allowed to move back after the construction. The main street of the area, Qianmen Street, is completely remodeled in historical style. As you see, there's a street lamp on the photo, so it looks like there are two bird cages hanging there. That's because bird cage is a symbol of old Beijing. You know, in the old days, men, especially old men in Beijing, they would walk their birds. So they would carry the bird cages and walk around. If there's a little park, they would hang the bird cages on a tree and talk with one another. So now you understand why they make the street lamps look like this. So they're trying very hard to emphasize the historical taste of the area. But at the same time, all those old shops and restaurants were forced to close, and they're replaced by new stores like Rolex, Tiffany, and Starbucks. And the local officials told me their goal is to turn Qianmen Street into Champs-Élysées. So as you can imagine, when you see projects like those, you begin to wonder what historical preservation is. And after I traveled to other cities in the world, I realized that Beijing is not alone. In cities from east to west, the practice of historic preservation has become increasingly complicated and controversial. So here are my research questions. First, why do governments in different cities have different understandings of what historic preservation is and make distinct decisions about what to preserve and how to preserve them? Second, how are preservation initiatives implemented? Why are some of them more likely to be carried out than others? Historic preservation is a very complex process and is influenced by a variety of factors. I listed some elements here, and I'm sure there are still many factors I cannot include on this list. All these factors are important, but we cannot have a complete understanding of the policy process of historical preservation without knowing how politics works. And there are actually more and more studies in the field of historic preservation to emphasize the importance of politics. And most scholars would highlight that politics matters, but they didn't really tell us how. So I wanted to bring my expertise as a political scientist to the study of historic preservation in order to contribute to a better understanding of the political dimension of historic preservation. And my research builds on two major theories: policy discourse and historical institutionalism. According to policy discourse theory, the essence of any public policy is political reasoning. It offers policymakers a language to form their argument and fulfill their goals. Historical institutionalism. What is institution? Institution is a set of organizations, rules, and procedures. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. Institutions don't dictate the policy outcomes, but they influence the policy process by defining the rules of the games, shaping actors' power and interests, and mediating their interactions. So building on those two major schools of theories, I argue that historic preservation has become a strategic device for different political and social actors to fulfill their distinct goals. In the process of forming and implementing preservation initiatives, actors are constrained by the fragmented urban power structure. Political fragmentation serves as a filter that shapes the policy process and generates different patterns of preservation. Okay, as you can see, the major theory I try to propose here is a theory of political fragmentation. So let me elaborate the concept a little bit. I define political fragmentation as the dispersed allocation of decision-making authority among multiple jurisdictions. In order to understand how political fragmentation influences the policy process of preservation, we first of all need to know how political systems are fragmented. And to solve this issue, I developed a typology of political fragmentation. I argue in my book, political systems are fragmented in three major ways: functional, territorial, and intergovernmental. So functional fragmentation is between bureaucratic agencies at the same administrative level. For instance, between the Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Finance, or between the City Department of Housing and Department of Urban Planning. Territorial fragmentation is a spatial relation between government units at the same tier of the state apparatus. For instance, between cities, or between boroughs, or between states. And both functional and territorial fragmentation are horizontal relationships. And intergovernmental fragmentation is a vertical relationship between government units at different tiers of the state apparatus. For instance, between the national government and the municipality, or between the province and the county. And I must say here, the typology shows you some ideal types. In reality, a political system usually is a mix of different types. But the purpose of the typology is to help us identify the major type of political fragmentation, so we have the basis to compare different cities. Then the next question is, how does political fragmentation influence historic preservation? Basically, political fragmentation serves as a filter. A preservation initiative is more likely to be implemented if it's within the boundary of one jurisdiction, and less likely so if it's across different jurisdictions. So what if a preservation initiative is across different jurisdictions? Different types of political fragmentation are associated with different settlements and policy processes. We will talk about the mechanisms later when we look at the three cases. Now let me briefly talk about my case selection. So in this book, I look at three cases: Beijing, Chicago, and Paris. You know, the three cities are different in terms of everything, right? History, culture, socioeconomic conditions, lifestyle, food, everything is different. But these are all great cities in the history of architecture and urban planning. And also they all constantly face a tension between preservation and development. And here's a snapshot of the three cities. As you see from this figure, political fragmentation serves different purposes in the three cities. At the same time, different types of political fragmentation shapes the formation and implementation of preservation initiatives in various ways, and eventually they create different patterns of preservation. Again, we'll talk about the cases in more detail later, and now let me give you a quick overview of data and methods. So this is largely a qualitative study, and the primary data was collected from fieldwork and archival research. From 2003 to 2010, I spent 24 months in the field and conducted 210 interviews. And my interviewees include local and national officials, preservation and planning professionals, developers, and the community organizers. So besides doing interviews, I also tried to immerse myself in the rich urban texture of every city. That is actually the most enjoyable part of the research. Of course, I walked a lot, from historical urban core to inner city neighborhoods to newly developed outskirts, and I saw lots of preservation battles. Also, I conducted archival research in 8 academic libraries in the 3 cities. Here you can see the source of my archival data. All right, now I would like to move on to the empirical cases, and I want to begin from Beijing. I don't know how many of you have been to Beijing. If you have not, I would like to welcome you to go to my hometown. And here are some photos of Beijing, and the one on the left is the image, is the map of the old city. So the urban design of old Beijing was laid out in the early 15th century based on Chinese design philosophy of symmetry, hierarchy, and unity. The whole city is divided into 4 roughly concentric circles. From the middle, you see there's the Forbidden City, Imperial City, Inner City, and the Outer City. And each is surrounded by a city wall. There's a central axis running south to north, and many historical monuments are situated along this central axis. Okay, Siheyuan, or courtyard house, is the typical residential style in Beijing. This is a 1-story house with a courtyard in the middle. And the hutong you see from the photo on the right, this is the metro line lined up by the houses. Because the main rooms of all the houses face south, in order to get the maximum amount of sunshine, many hutongs are from east to west. And there are some smaller lines from north to south for a convenient passage. So the whole street pattern looks like a chessboard. This kind of urban landscape was largely intact until the communist regime came to power in 1949. So there were 2 waves of destruction to the historical city. From 1950s to the 70s, many historical monuments were demolished for ideological reasons because they were considered as the symbols of the backward imperial political order. At the same time, the courtyard houses began to dilapidate. To improve the living conditions of the residents, the municipality launched a citywide housing renewal project from early 1990s. It's called the Program of Old and Dilapidated Housing Renewal. So it started as a social welfare program, but very quickly, under the collaboration of local officials and developers, it became real estate speculation, and many old houses were demolished. And you can see how massive the demolition was from the changes in the number of hutong. And this kind of demolition was widely reported and criticized. I'm sure many of you read about it in the newspaper. And after Beijing was chosen as the host city of the Olympic Games, the government faced more pressure from the international society. It was against this background the government changed its agenda from demolition to preservation. So it restored and reconstructed lots of historical monuments, increased its budget for preservation, and also made new preservation plans. But those policies didn't lead to a better protection of the old city. Why is that? To answer this question, we need to take a look at the political structure of historic preservation in Beijing. So in both Chicago and Paris, there is a commission appointed by the mayor in charge of preservation, but there is no unitary agency like that in Beijing. The authority of historic preservation is dispersed among 5 municipal bureaus, as you see from this figure. In this situation, it's not clear who's responsible for what. So although many agencies are involved, no one takes the responsibility. And it is especially difficult to preserve old neighborhoods in this situation because the old neighborhoods in Beijing are overcrowded and many of them don't have basic infrastructure. So in order to effectively preserve those neighborhoods, you need to figure out lots of issues like how to reduce the density of population, where to relocate people, how to finance the construction of urban infrastructure. It's a huge project and very hard to be implemented in a functionally fragmented system like this. So to facilitate the collaboration between different bureaucratic agencies, the municipality created a special commission. It's called, okay, can you see that? It's at the bottom. Commission on Social Housing Construction, Old and Dilapidated Housing Renewal, and Historic Preservation. All right, how do you feel? The name is very long, right? Yes, probably too many things for one commission. And I want to emphasize that this is not an independent commission. This is actually a commission made up by the top officials from all those 5 bureaus. So it actually became a battlefield for different bureaucratic interests because within this commission, they still prioritize the interests of their own bureaus, and they didn't achieve anything. In 2000, the municipality designated 30 old neighborhoods as preservation districts. So this is the first time in the history of Beijing the entire neighborhoods are recognized as preservation districts. So it was considered as a big achievement. And after the designation, the Planning Commission made preservation plans for all those districts. But nothing happened after the plans were made. I talked to one official who's actually in charge of making the plans, and I asked him, why you didn't do anything to implement the plans? And he told me, my job is only to make the plans, no more than that. Because the municipality didn't offer any particular guideline on how to preserve those old neighborhoods, the powers devolved to the district governments. And district officials have lots of discretion to decide how to preserve, how to deal with the old neighborhoods. So some neighborhoods are demolished and remodeled, like the case of Qianmen we saw at the very beginning. Here's another case. Shisha, this is the largest preservation district in Beijing, has the largest natural lake of the city. It used to be a very quiet area, but the district government wants to develop tourism economy, so it became a bar district. And almost every old house along the lake or facing the street is turned into a bar. And as you see from the photo, there are many pedicabs running in the neighborhood to show people around. I think you probably should go there and have a drink if you go to Beijing and see what you'll feel. And I think to some extent it becomes a Disneyland. And the life quality of the local community is undermined because they have to suffer from so many issues like the crowds, the noise at night, and the increase of price. Okay, so from the various cases we see in Beijing, historic preservation is a tool for the local government to promote economic growth and to create a better image for the city. And functional fragmentation between different bureaucratic agencies increases the difficulty of comprehensively protecting the old city. And when historical monuments are restored or reconstructed, but old neighborhoods are demolished or remodeled into entertainment districts, historic preservation in Beijing is increasingly symbolic. All right, now let's come back to Chicago. Yeah, obviously it's a more exciting place, right? So I have been in Chicago for almost 6 years now and have experienced many great things about the city, except for the winter. And I heard people say Chicago has 2 seasons, winter and construction. Is that true?
Yeah.
I think that's quite true.
Yeah,
yes. So we're still in the winter season. We'll see when the next one will come. So Chicago is much younger than Beijing or Paris, but it's a very important city in terms of modern architecture and urban design. And if we want to understand the politics of historic preservation in Chicago, we must take a look at 2 maps. Okay, the one on the left is the Chicago neighborhood map. Chicago has more than 100 neighborhoods. Every neighborhood has unique history, culture, architectural heritage. And the one on the right is a ward map. The city is politically divided into 50 wards. Each ward has an alderman. And all those 50 aldermen make up the city council. Okay, so why are the 2 maps important? I will show you in a minute. And now let's take a look at the process of local landmark designation in Chicago. In the center of the process is the Commission on Chicago Landmarks. This is an independent advisory board created in 1957. It has 9 members. All of them are appointed by the mayor. This commission is staffed by Historic Preservation Division. And this division is part of the City Department of Planning and Development. So basically, if anyone or any community in Chicago wants to have their buildings or areas designated as local landmark, they must propose to the division first. Then the division will decide whether to prepare a research report for the proposal. If they decide to prepare the report and after the report is done, it will be submitted to the commission for review. The commission will hold public hearings, will discuss, and then will vote on the proposal. And if the commission votes yes, the proposal will be passed to the city council. That's where the 50 aldermen sit, as you all know. And then the city council will have the final vote. All right, so it looks like aldermen will not enter the process of local landmark designation until the last minute. But the truth is, the commission will not prepare the report on a preservation proposal unless the proposal is supported by the local aldermen. Okay, so this is something you wouldn't know if you only look at the formal procedure or look at what's written on the paper. And a landmark commissioner in Chicago told me this. She said, aldermen's support is critical to landmark designation. The city staff doesn't propose buildings or districts to be landmarks if the aldermen don't support. because of how the city government works in Chicago. If the individual alderman doesn't support the proposal, most of the rest of the aldermen will defer to him or her, and the proposal will not be passed in the city council. Okay, and her words were verified by a alderman. The alderman said, "There's no city policy on historic preservation. It's pretty much individual words. That's the way the whole city is. The way I usually describe it is like Europe in the Middle Ages. The mayor is a king in the court of downtown, and we are in the provinces. We have a great deal of discretion in our provinces as long as we don't challenge the king. We also support our colleagues on what they want to do in their territories, so we can do what we want in ours." All right, that's one of my favorite quotes. And it says a lot, right? So what the alderman reveals is actually a tradition called aldermanic prerogative in Chicago. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. Basically, this is aldermen's special veto power over their ward issues. This is particularly influential when they deal with land-related issues like zoning, redevelopment, and preservation. And what I want to emphasize is that aldermen's support is not only critical for local landmark designation. Their opinions are also important if a community wants to be recognized in federal preservation programs, because those programs usually require local political support. And now we can come back to the maps. So in my research of Chicago, I look at two neighborhoods, Pilsen and Brownsville. Okay, so Pilsen, as you know, is very close to UIC. This is the smaller red area on the map. And Brownsville is the larger red area. This is an African American community, used to be called the Black Metropolis. Why did I choose the two neighborhoods? Because there were preservation movements in both neighborhoods at about the same time, but the outcomes were very different. The Pilsen community wanted to be listed on the National Register of Historical Places. They began their application in 2005, and the application was approved within 5 months. And in Brownsville, some community organizations began to actively seek the status of National Heritage Area in 2000. But after 13 years, they still didn't get it. So why the outcomes are so different? In my research, I found the different outcomes have a lot to do with their different locations on the ward map. Okay, as you can see from this ward map, Pilsen is in the heart of the 25th ward. And where's Brownsville? Brownsville is divided by 3 different wards, the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th. So their different locations on the political map of Chicago has a lot to do, explains a lot of their different outcomes in preservation movements. And in Pilsen, the alderman supported the landmark designation because he considers this is a great chance to increase the property value of the area. Then it can enhance the overall economic and political capacity of the alderman. And in Brownsville, none of the 3 aldermen supported the landmark designation because they consider the creation of a unified heritage area is a threat to their local monopoly. And I talked to many municipal and federal officials during my fieldwork, and all of them told me if the aldermen don't support, there's little chance for the bill to be passed in the Congress. All right, now the question is, how would it look like if we put the 2 maps together? Here the red lines are the neighborhood boundaries, and the blue lines are the ward boundaries. After we put the 2 maps together, we can clearly see the mismatch of boundaries. And in this situation, if a neighborhood is across different wards or is politically divided, it's very difficult for the whole neighborhood to be preserved as a whole. And because preservation areas in Chicago are largely confined within individual wards, they look like mosaics. That's why I call it mosaic preservation. And there's little protection of the overall urban landscape in this kind of scenario. Okay, now I think we're ready to go to Paris. Are you ready? Paris is usually considered as one of the most well-preserved cities in the world, but it's not a city without changes. The biggest urban transformation happened in the late 19th century when Haussmann demolished most of the medieval urban texture and built wide boulevards and uniform apartment buildings. And there was another proposal to demolish the old city. It was in the post-war era. The proposal was to build highways and skyscrapers in the city. But it only led to sporadic changes. And to reduce the burden of new development on the old city, a new central business district was created in La Défense outside the old city, as you see from the photo here. Okay, so why is Paris much better preserved than many cities in the world? Some people say because the French care about culture, or because they have a long history of preservation. Okay, I think these are all important reasons. But what I want to emphasize is actually the political structure of urban preservation in Paris. And one thing I want to tell you first is Paris didn't have a mayor until 1977. So for over 200 years, the city was governed by a prefect appointed by the national authority. And historic preservation had long been the privilege of the national government. And the government uses a comprehensive legal framework to protect its own, built environment. Here are some major preservation laws in France, and I want to emphasize the last two. So the 1943 Act extends the protection of both historical monuments and sites to their surrounding areas within a radius of 500 meters. So in other words, what's being protected are not only individual buildings and sites, but their surrounding urban environment. And this one, the 1962 Marlowe Act, it legalized the designation of historical neighborhoods as protected areas. This is the most powerful tool used by the state to protect the old neighborhoods. Because if an area is designated as protected area, it cannot be included in any local development plan. So anything in the neighborhood, demolition, planning, development has to be regulated by a plan of protection and development made by the state. Okay, so what's the situation of the cultural heritage area in Paris? In Paris, there are 1,900 historical monuments and 2 protected areas. The 2 protected areas are the large white areas on the map. One is Loumahé on the right bank of the Seine. The other one is part of the 7th arrondissement on the left bank of the river. And if we combine the historical monuments, the protected areas, and also their surrounding environment, almost 80% of Paris's land is under state protection. Okay, it's a huge area, right? So who's in charge of this huge heritage area? The Ministry of Culture. The Ministry of Culture is the state agency in charge of preservation issue in France. And the ministry relies on a group of highly specialized civil servants to supervise the protection of cultural heritage in the whole country. They are called architects of historical monuments. And Paris is divided into 20 arrondissements, or 20 local districts. And there are 8 architects of historical monuments in Paris. So every architect is in charge of 2 to 3 local districts. So this centralized protection of cultural heritage in Paris is actually discussed in many textbooks on historic preservation. It also prevents many problems we saw in Beijing or Chicago. But that's not the end of the story. Think about it. If 80% of a city's land is under state control, do you think the city will be happy about it? Probably not. So let's take a look at the reaction of the city government. Paris got its first elected mayor in 1977. He was Jacques Chirac. As you know, Chirac was the former president of France. And in fact, he was the mayor of Paris for 20 years until he became the president of the country. He was a tough leader, and under his leadership, Paris began to challenge the authority of the national government. For example, the national government always wants to designate a 3rd protected area in Paris. But the city refuses the proposal over and over again. That is why, until today, there are only 2 protected areas in Paris. And France began decentralization reform from the early 1980s, so it further enhances the power of the city. Empowered by the decentralization laws, Paris made its first local development plan in 2006. So the dynamics between the 2 layers of government can be illustrated by those figures. Okay, you can see the huge contrast before and after decentralization reform. And after decentralization, the jurisdiction of the municipality has expanded, but the state has not withdrawn. So there are more overlaps, more conflicts between the 2 levels of government when dealing with the issues of cultural heritage preservation. The most dramatic case happened in 2006. In this year, Paris designated over 5,000 buildings as municipal heritage. This is a landmark event because that's the first time in the history of Paris the city designated its own cultural heritage. But right after the designation, the national government announced those as illegal. And the Ministry of Culture said, you cannot do this. You're a city government. You don't have the legitimacy to deal with cultural heritage. And eventually, the national government sued the city of Paris. At that time, I was doing field work in Paris. I guess I was lucky to observe this battle. And all the officials I met at that time would talk with me about this case. And of course, their opinions are different, depending on whether they are from the national government or from the municipality. But they were all very upset. This case was in court for a year. And finally, the judge decided that those municipal heritage buildings are legal. But to compromise, the city agreed to keep working with the national government on the daily practice of urban preservation. So as you see from this case and several other cases we talked about, there are competing discourses of historic preservation in Paris. For the national government, cultural heritage is a source of the French national identity, so they implemented the centralized control of the built environment. And the city began to actively engage in preservation in order to claim its control over this urban agenda. And under the situation of intergovernmental fragmentation, we see a pattern of contested and shared control because the two levels of government are highly interdependent. And eventually, historic preservation is shifted from the monopoly of the state to a joint venture between the city and the national government. All right, now I would like to quickly summarize the findings and offer some reflection. First of all, it's important to understand the governance structure of historic preservation. Because when we talk about preservation, oftentimes we pay attention to individual actors. We often consider preservation is a battle between developers, between bad developers and good preservationists. But I think we need to pay attention to the overall governance structure because the cases of the three cities show that preservation policies are politically made and implemented in a complex institutional setting. So if we want to improve the quality of those policies, we need to understand this institutional perspective of preservation policy. And one major policy implication from the study is we need to overcome the hurdles of political fragmentation in order to be able to more comprehensively and effectively protect our built environment. And the second, I want to emphasize the value of a comparative approach in the study of preservation. Every city is different. It has to be studied differently with careful investigation of its culture and history. But the most useful insights about preservation issues are usually learned from lessons in other places. So it's important for us to have a comparative international perspective in the research and also the practice of preservation issues. And finally, I have some thoughts about historic preservation in the changing world. If we take a look at the history of preservation, we'll see preservation movements always take place when the society faces major changes, like industrialization or post-war urban renewal. And nowadays, again, the world is facing dramatic changes. For the first time in human history, more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. And globalization, deindustrialization have greatly changed the economic, social, and spatial dimensions of the cities. So in this situation, a question for any scholar in the field, for any practitioner of preservation, or for any citizen interested in or love our cities, the question is, what is the significance of historic preservation nowadays when all sorts of cities are undertaking vast changes? For instance, what can preservation tell us about helping to restore the quality of life in cities like Detroit? How can preservation mobilize and work in countries like China, where the government controls so much of the policy agenda and the participation of citizens is almost non-existent? And what about Rio de Janeiro, a city where almost 1/3 of its population lives in informal housing settlement, and the government is carrying out a large scale of redevelopment for the World Cup and the Olympics? To answer these questions, I think we need to see preservation in a larger light. We need to better integrate preservation policy into a broader agenda of urban transformation. Of course, it is not easy, but I think it's important to have this kind of vision when we examine preservation issues. I recently began a new research project, as some of you know, about the formation and the governance of megacities in China, India, and Brazil. And one thing I try to do in this project is try to connect preservation with a variety of policy issues like affordable housing, mega event planning, and urban citizenship. Because I want to figure out whether preservation can offer a new model of urban regeneration and can contribute to the production of a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable urban environment. I think it's only when we are able to see preservation in the larger light or to situate preservation in a broader urban context, we can really fulfill this humanistic concern in the heart of historic preservation. I think I'm going to end here, and now I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Comments and questions?
Yes, Bob.
You seem to make two basic assumptions. The first is that preservation is better than just letting things be redeveloped. And from that seems to come a second, which is that fragmented government or government in competition is not as good as unified government. But could you argue the opposite of continuous?
Yes. Well, I think first of all, those are very good questions. In terms of the basic assumption, is preservation always a good thing? I think it's actually very controversial because we see in cases like, in some cases, especially in many European cities, lots of citizens are complaining, like people living in Rome, they would say, we're almost like living in a museum because nothing can be changed. Even if I want to change the color of my curtain, I need to ask the government. And also in some communities, preservation actually can become the tool to reinforce economic, social inequality, like especially in the American context, because they become a tool to increase property value. Then you have the issue of gentrification. So I think that's a great point. I don't think preservation is always a good thing, but it really depends on the context in which you are implementing the preservation projects. And also, I think if we compare preservation and the demolition, I think we also need to be aware of the negative impact preservation would cause on the community. So I think in that sense, preservation do have its own merits, but I think the practice varies. Then that leads to different effects of preservation. And then the second question is fragmentation. So that is, I'm sorry, would you repeat the second question?
Is fragmentation inherently bad? Isn't it just as likely that competition and government agencies
Right.
create better policy?
Right, that's also a good point. And actually, fragmentation is thoroughly studied in lots of literature in political science, in urban studies. And scholars do point out there are both positive and negative impacts of political fragmentation. So for instance, political fragmentation can include more actors in the decision-making process, can make the decision-making process more informative, more deliberate, and also can offer the chances for market to have the market computation. But I think if we apply the theory of political fragmentation into the process of preservation, the empirical cases shows there are negative impacts, and I think the empirical cases shows that the negative impacts in the particular issue area of preservation seems to be stronger than the positive impacts of fragmentation on other issue areas. Any other questions? Yes.
So how does the political structure in these different cities affect the way that historic preservation academies and organizations organize themselves?
Oh, you mean to influence like the involvement of the advocacy groups, right? It's a very good question, and from my research, I find political fragmentation because that's a description of the overall governance structure, and this structure actually shapes how those advocacy groups would relate with one another, or how they can influence the policy process. I can give you one example. In Paris, for a long time, preservation was the monopoly of national government. And there are basically very little civic engagement because everything was managed by this cultural elite, those national, those architects of historical monuments. recently, more and more civic groups in Paris begin to be actively engaged. That's actually thanks to the decentralization reform. Because after decentralization, the city wants to enhance its control over preservation. So it begins to mobilize the civic groups. And by doing that, the city can say, we have a democratic basis of our decisions, right? Like we are supported, our opinions are from our people. So in other words, I see that political fragmentation sometimes can offer different channels for the groups to penetrate the policy process. And also the policy makers sometimes will choose how to mobilize resources and whom to allow to enter the policy process based on their power competition, based on the political fragmentation process. Does it make sense?
I'm perhaps a little uninformed here, but how does one measure the success of preservation? How does one say that this is better to preserve than something else? Is it just a matter of everyone agreeing, or in the case of Paris, where there's one central, at least up until recently, there's just one central government and they say this is what's going to be preserved? What is it that makes one area merit preservation and not another? And just to be a devil's advocate, what's so wrong with rebuilding something so that there's a symbolic piece of preservation when you have the opportunity then to update an area and make the infrastructure more modern so that people aren't in the situation of not being able to bring in certain kinds of, whether it's internet or cables or whatever, to upgrade when you can't in some districts that are historically preserved.
Right. So the first question actually, Dina asked about the criteria of preservation.
Yeah, what makes one thing more worthy of preserving than another? Just chance that it's still here?
Okay, yes. And I'm not sure how many of you are actually involved in the area of historic preservation. And there are actually many criteria people are looking at in this field. So for instance, it's based on different values, like historical value of the building, based on when the building was built, how old the building was, and also the aesthetic value, in terms of whether it represents an important architectural style. And then there's also the value related to the whether it's kind of an important historical legacy related to certain historical moments in the society. And then sometimes people would care about the age value, whether this building has gone through a long period of time and can really show us what the history was. So in other words, we need to combine the different historical value, aesthetic value, and the social value of the building when you judge what to preserve. And then in terms of the other question, I totally agree with you. Personally, I think the rebuild of the monuments, especially the one we saw in Beijing, is quite problematic. Especially when you see, a building was rebuilt in historical style, and then at the same time, some authentic ones are demolished. Right? It's very problematic. And in other words, I think. But in terms of improving or upgrading the old urban infrastructure, upgrading the urban texture in the cities, I think the most important thing is actually to be sensitive to the urban fabric. In other words, so for the old neighborhoods in Beijing, the old houses, it's actually important to upgrade the urban infrastructure. But how to do that? Whether you demolish those houses and then build the sewage and everything, then build something new in old style, or you do a thorough investigation and then improve the quality of the infrastructure. I think it's two different ways of dealing with things. And the problem is we saw too much rebuilt in reality. I don't know whether that answers your second question.
I'm really just being devil's advocate because sometimes, I'm really going to be brutal here. Sometimes it's very difficult to rebuild in place. It's a very difficult style, and I see for example, economically, other countries that unfortunately were perhaps largely demolished by war, being rebuilt and now having an economic advantage over areas that still have older buildings that were not demolished. Look at like Chicago Fire, or in this country, maybe the Chicago Fire, or San Francisco after an earthquake, have the opportunity to be rebuilt perhaps into something better. This is not necessarily the Chicago historically as it was when it was originally built. And what's good? I mean, is that just natural disaster or war, unfortunately,
Right.
humanitarian disaster, or when do you get the chance to brush aside and make new history?
Yes, I agree with you. I think there's lots of cities would go through the natural regeneration, or sometimes if there are events like the war or the fire, it's something we cannot control, and then the urban fabric would be demolished. And then I think in this process, to have this natural regeneration, I think it's just a natural thing. But I think what is dangerous for cities is that the policymakers rushed into the process of regenerating the city. So, for instance, like the cities the cases we see in Beijing is not a natural process. It's really totally man-made, driven by economic interest and also the political interest. So I think there's totally nothing wrong with rebuilding, and also, actually, history is a relative concept, right? What's defined as history? How old is old? Maybe something we built yesterday can be considered as history if you look at it today. So I think the whole concept behind preservation is not against the construction of new designs, of new buildings, but rather to be sensitive to the existing urban environment. And also, I think to take into account the human dimension in this process. Yes.
To kind of bridge off of Nina's comment, I just wonder how much it has to do too with whoever has power at the given time when the conversation is happening, in terms of who defines what is historically important. And so I wonder, one of the things that I was wondering in terms of your comparisons is, did you notice, because most of your focus as a political scientist is a lot of institutional state or government, what were the different community engagement pieces in these cities? Community engagement in terms of, like, is there a historic preservation committee that is, comprised of citizens or residents? And how much say do they actually have in terms of determining the historic preservation agenda for the city at a given time?
Okay, I think some of us sitting here are more like an expert than me to talk about this issue. And I think the profile of civic engagement in the three cities are very different, or in the three countries in general, and in Chicago, or in the whole context of American cities. Actually, preservation movement began from the bottom up. You have a strong tradition of civic engagement. It was led by lots of civic advocates, and it's really people's strong passion to preserve places, of local history, important for the community. And actually, in the 1960s, when preservation movement formally began in this country, the government began the different legislation, the creation of government agency of preservation is really mainly driven by the passion or by the actions of civic groups. So there's a very strong tradition of civic engagement in Chicago and also in American cities. Even today, you see many preservation organizations in this country. But then in France, it is more driven by a whole group of cultural elites, like the architects of historical monuments, like I mentioned. And there was no public participation, very little, for no public hearing until recently in Paris. When they began decentralization reform, then they began to invite public elites to decide what to preserve. So in other words, you actually see there's a difference in terms of the elitist top-down pattern versus the bottom-up. Some pattern driven by the involvement of civic groups in different contexts.
What about in Beijing?
In Beijing, well, like I mentioned, the involvement of the civic society is almost non-existent. And actually, some people are debating whether there is a civil society in China at all. That's related to the tradition of Confucianism and also the lots of political evolutions in China. So the political, in other words, the power of the government is very strong, controls all those different issue areas, and the civic engagement is very minimal. Yes, very minimal in the Chinese context.
And so in terms of your concept of fragmentation, you're talking a lot about fragmentation of different governmental institutions, but considering citizen
that having more citizen engagement complicates the process more, or it's more efficient means to an end?
Okay, that's a good point, because civic engagement or the involvement of citizens and even the market is really something we need to take into account. So like I said, the whole argument of political fragmentation, the focus is the governance structure, but I don't deny the influence of other factors. But I think the fragmented power structure offers a playground for different actors to influence policy process. And in terms of the role of the civic groups, I think it definitely will make the picture more complicated. And also the most important thing, like I said earlier, who decide which civic group can influence policy, right? So at the end of the day, it is actually the policymakers, it is actually the local government that will make the decision to take their, to take their suggestions or not, or to make their voice heard or not. So that's why I say political fragmentation is a filter in this whole process. And as we see, they do give civic organizations chances to express their voices, but their voices are not always heard and not always influence policy process.
Sorry, I have one more question. It's mostly about the effectiveness of people who are coming into power. When the fascists were taking over Italy, for example, they were able to knock out sections of the city and put in train stations or rails and things like that. Things that were just absolutely unheard of before the fascists were in power, because you need to have that kind of power personality and be able to take out sections of cities like that. There's just like certain types of political structures and organizations where a democratic leader wouldn't do that to the city. Things like that. And now it's no longer, Italy is no longer fascist, it's a democracy again. But there are these fascist buildings in Italy, and they are just saturated with fascist propaganda, things like that. How do we deal with legacies of older political structures that remain in the city, and how do we also advocate for stronger political leaders who maybe are democratic to respect the fabric?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And actually the question touched upon some debates in the field of historic preservation, because we always face the issue. Because when we preserve the building, what the message we try to send here is we care about the history behind the building, right? So if there's a certain piece of history which you don't feel so proud of, or it's so problematic, what are we going to do with the building? And that's actually something not only existing in Italy for the fascist argument, but also in lots of post-colonial cities and countries, like in Shanghai, for instance. So people are talking about, shall we preserve the colonial heritage, or shall we just demolish them and preserve our own vernacular buildings? And I have to say, it's really a debatable issue. And from my personal point of view, I actually think there is certain value to preserve those buildings, because it's actually a record of history, and you let people see what the history was, and you protect them. That does not mean you agree with those political ideologies behind the buildings. And I think actually it's important to be open-minded and to be, and also to respect the diversity, both in terms of architectural design and also in terms of the history the buildings represent. And there was actually a certain period of time, I think it was probably in Chicago, for a certain period of time in the preservation movement, people actually only care about the skyscraper because they consider this as the symbol of the architectural success in Chicago, like the early skyscrapers. But people largely ignored the older buildings, like the Queen Anne style buildings. But I think it's important actually to be open-minded and to different histories, to different designs in the architectural profile. Any other questions?
Just to stem off
Sure.
of that, like within Beijing, because like you're saying within Shanghai, there's like a multiplicity of layers of history in terms of like post-colonialism. What initiatives has like the local government, the national government, taken to kind of or how do they view these sites as a site of that of historic preservation?
You mean the colonial legacies? Yeah. Okay. Well, that is mainly an issue for Shanghai, not for Beijing, because thank God we were not really colonized. And in Shanghai, so many those buildings were many of them are the financial buildings built by the French or by the Dutch. And nowadays, many of the buildings were well maintained. One thing is they are actually in pretty good condition compared to the vernacular buildings in Shanghai because they were they were made of stones. So, and many of them actually nowadays are still reused as banks. And I think they have been pretty well preserved. And then another issue in Shanghai is there is also the recent movement to protect the authentic Shanghainese building, the Shikumen, the vernacular building there. But they have been actually turned many of those vernacular buildings actually into like more for entertainment, like the case of Shanghai, what we saw here. So in other words, they have different attitudes in dealing with different types of buildings, and that's also related to the material, to the physical conditions of buildings. Any other questions? Okay, and I really hope I answered your question, or I answered some of your questions. And I want to thank you all for coming and for offering your thoughts here. Thank you.